Hello, everybody. Welcome to this meeting of talking about socialism from a Marxist point of view. My name is Nick Rack. I'm going to be chairing tonight's session. The discussion tonight is on the subject of the local elections that took place last Thursday. What do the results mean for socialists? And of course, we've had the further development with Keir Starmer's speech at the weekend, promising us a further attack on the left in terms of what he's called his clause 4 moment on steroids. We've got Will McMahon, who's going to introduce the discussion for just under 15 minutes, and then there'll be plenty of time for people to participate. The meeting is being live streamed on Facebook and being recorded and will be published on the internet. So bear that in mind if you want to speak or don't want to be seen. And when I call people in to speak to begin with, I'm just going to limit people to 3 minutes so that we can get everybody in. And then we'll see how that goes and when we can do a second round, and hopefully the conversation will develop a bit. So with that having been said, I'm going to introduce Will to kick off the discussion. Will.
Thanks very much, Nick. I'm going to make a few brief points. I'm going to try and cover a lot of ground and make a few points in each of the areas I talk about. The first thing that I want to talk about is the context of the local elections. I think there were four. One was the major cost of living crisis via inflation and its relationship to the Ukraine war. The second was the economic disaster that was Liz Truss and her brief reign. The third context, I think, was and it's a kind of an under the surface one in opinion polls, is the growing unpopularity of Brexit. And the fourth context, I think one would expect at this point a certain level of government fatigue. Having the same government in power for so long, about this time in the cycle, you would normally expect to see very heavy losses and a change of order being due. Now, I don't think this has happened really. So, because Labour should have won these local elections by some distance, it should be a party that is preparing for power in October 24. And my view, it should have done better. And I think in the end, what we got was a Tory drubbing rather than a Labour triumph. So if we look at the four context points I've made, I think we can see what part of the issue is for Labour. Because when it comes to the living crisis and the Ukraine war, Labour supports the war, and it can only ask for ameliorative cost of living crisis policies because it wants to present itself as fiscally responsible. So you can't spend too much. So they can't make gains on that key context. In terms of the Tories' record on the economy, although Truss crashed it, I think it's fair to say that Sunak and Hunt, from a kind of a electoral perspective, look competent. They've got time to bring a bit of good news in time for the next election. And it seems to me that Labour doesn't have an alternative economic plan. It's only got a shadowing plan for the Tories. And I think that's going to remain the same, because as they move to the right, being able to differentiate between them is going to be quite difficult. I think also that there's in the opinion polls, you can see over the series, there's clearly a growing regrexit, they call it. So the latest poll has got us at 53% think Brexit was a bad idea, 33% think it was a good idea. Now, of course, Starmer's accepted Brexit. And I'm making this point, whether you're for it or against it or neutral, I just think it's a political fact that Starmer is unable to reposition the Labour Party at this stage around Brexit because he's just said we've accepted it. And the final point about government fatigue, which I think Labour's relying on, I think they're relying on it to drop in their lap a little bit. Yeah, I think Sunak can do a bit of a John Major here. I think he can present as a managerial figure. Somebody who played a Gordon Brown-like role during the pandemic, keeping the economy afloat, he would say, and he can also promise a calmer period of government. So it's a bit of a John Major vibe they've got going on there with Sunak. So all of those four contexts, which should really have helped Labour had it been more radical. They're not able to access them at all. And I think this showed in the election results. And I think the other thing is that Starmer's obviously got a major image problem. Yeah. I mean, he doesn't come across well, but also I think he has a problem with people who might vote Green or Lib Dem because he's coming across as increasingly authoritarian, actually, in terms of what he's doing in the party, in terms of what he's supporting in public. And while his strength was he was the right candidate for the right of the Labour Party to get rid of Corbyn, to hoodwink quite a lot of people in his election campaign, I think his real weakness is there's little chance of him using the same formula as part of a general election. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to screen share the results. So you just have to hang on a sec while I do that. Okay, so what we can see here is the election results, and I won't go on too much about this, but it clearly looks, the Tories had a terrible night, lost 1,000 seats. And you can see that Labour got 500, but actually there are other parties doing quite well. You can also see that the no overall control is the largest number of council seats, and I think that tells a story in itself. This table here is the vote, the share of vote extrapolated from detailed ward by ward voting figures in 45 of the 230 councils where elections were held on May 4th. This was done by the BBC, and this is the kind of vote that Labour would expect in this, if it was to have a general election now. I think that's what they're arguing. So the key points are the Tories lost the majority of their councils to the Liberal Democrats, or no overall control. The second key point is the Liberal Democrats, given their membership and size and their base in Parliament, I think outperformed the Labour Party. And the third point is that given the political context I outlined at the start, is it not surprising that Labour just didn't get more than 35%? For me, it is. I'd like to know what other people think. There are three other points to consider. One, the Tory voters stayed at home. They were just pissed off, basically, and they stayed at home. And John Curtis, who I think is a fairly respected psephologist, he's pretty neutral. He's the only person I saw mentioning the Socialist Alliance 20 years ago as appearing in the opinion polls. So I've always had a good time for him. John Curtis said the Labour Party's tally is no better than its score in the last year's local elections. This raises questions about whether the outcome was more an expression of discontent with the government than enthusiasm for Labour's alternative. I didn't feel there was any enthusiasm for Labour's alternative, and I think it's pretty evident that a lot of Tory voters just stayed at home, basically. Another point to consider is the further Starmer goes to the right, the more he leaves his notional, and I don't mean these are left-wing parties, but his notional left flank open to the Greens, the Liberal Democrats, and the SNP. The more votes are going to be shaved off that side. And the third point, I think, which is important, is that there's still 18 months to go for a general election. Food and fuel prices should start coming down. In fact, there are now 2 inquiries with the supermarkets and with the fuel companies about why they're charging so much, and the government's behind driving those, so they can see it's a problem. And I think to a degree, time is on the side of the Tories, actually, in terms of the next general election. So from my perspective, the main thing that these local elections tell us is that at present, majority Labour government is not on the cards at all. Sky News election analyst Michael Thrasher said that based on the votes across 1,500 wards, he thinks Labour's at about 36%. So it's pretty similar to what the BBC has come up with. And he argues that if it stays like that, and governing parties usually start to cash as you get closer to the election, Labour would gain 95 seats, but they'd be 28 short of an overall majority. So I think we're heading for a coalition or minority party government, something that's kind of a midpoint between the election of 2011 and the election of 2015. And I think the Labour leadership know this. I think they know that Starmer will need a political narrative to break Tories from their traditional voting patterns. And I think this explains his latest speech, which I'll come back to in a moment. Now, before we get there, what happened to some of the candidates that might be thought of as being to the left of the Labour Party? I've had a quick look at the data. I can't promise that I've reviewed it all in detail, but I've had a look around the data. And so first of all, I want to talk about Tusk. And I think in terms of political character, their manifesto was a local council manifesto on a no-cuts basis. And it actually seemed to me to avoid any mention of national or international questions at all, on the basis that it was just a local election, which frankly, personally, I think that's politically wrong, but that's what they did. They put forward 254 candidates across 247 wards, across 65 local authorities. They had a couple mayoral candidates. Most of their candidates were Socialist Party members, but there were also members of the SWP, Anti-Capitalist Resistance. Some Northern Independence Party people were involved as well. Now, in 39 wards, they polled over 5% across 30 local authorities. In Leicester, Sheffield, Brighton, Hull and Southampton, quite a few Tusk candidates, and by quite a few, I mean multiples in those areas, got between 2.5 and 4.9%. If you look at Liverpool independent candidates, really the political character of this campaign, I think, it kind of reminded me of the Socialist Party in Hackney in the early 2000s. It was against austerity and corruption and for community leadership. And there's a bit of an environmental tinge to it as well. So its politics were not socialist, were not clearly socialist. So it was a very localized phenomena following some vicious political fighting in the Labour Party in Liverpool with some incredibly popular people, as it turned out. Because as we know, Alan Gibbons got 1,400 votes. He got 76.9%, which is absolutely incredible. Some of the candidates got 50%, 45%, 32%, 21%, all the way down to 12%. So that was, in one terms, a magnificently localized and very good campaign. But actually, socialist politics seemed to me to be absent from it, from what I saw. The third set I want to talk about very quickly is the ex-Labour candidates in Leicester, who all had to stand as independents because they were bumped out fairly late on in the process. And they got one candidate, Gary, can't remember his surname, apologies, got a really good vote. He got 18.1%. Another candidate got 9.9%, and the third one got 5.3%, who were standing to the left of Labour. So my reading of these results, and I know people can feel these are small numbers, but I actually think these results were respectable. And I think that, those kind of percentages in this kind of circumstances were quite good. And I think that over time, it indicates that a space to the left of the Labour for an alternative that's explicitly socialist, trade unionist, community-based is possible. That's my reading of those results at first sight. This brings me to Starmer's speech this Saturday just gone at the Progressive Britain conference, where he said quite a lot of things actually, but where he said, this is about taking our party back to where we belong and where we always should have been, back doing what we were created to do. That's why I say this project goes further and deeper than New Labour's rewriting as Clause 4. This is about rolling our sleeves up, changing our entire culture, our DNA. This is Clause 4 on steroids. Now, this is clearly a call to abandon any form of socialism at all by Starmer and go back to the Blair Project, which was the creation of a centre ground party based on free market economics and deregulation, which is what Blairism was really about, actually. And so we can expect a range of policies that will focus on the traditional one nation Tory voters, because that's who they're targeting, and they want to win them over so they can form a majority. I think that's the plan. And also I noticed a little straw in the wind, which I thought was quite interesting about what might be developing behind the scenes, was the electoral experiment in Bracknell Forest, where Labour and Liberal Democrats didn't stand against each other in any ward. And as a result of this, the Tories went from 38 seats to 10. Labour went from 3 seats to 22. And the Lib Dems went from 1 seat to 7, and the Greens got a couple of seats. So this is actually the Progressive Alliance in action. Labour did not stand against the Liberals, they just stood against the Tories. And the Liberals didn't stand against Labour, they stood against the Tories as well, and they wiped the Tories out, basically. And you can see the argument coming over the hill. This is the way to establish centre ground hegemony and keep the Tories out of power forever. I think that's the argument that's going to come. This was the central idea of Blair's third way. It was to re-establish the Liberal-Labour coalition, which preceded the formation of the Labour Party, because he basically, like Starmer, has rejected socialism and wants to go in a capitalist direction. Blair said, the ideological differences between me and many of the Liberal Democrats are pretty small. And actually, I think in terms of Starmer, Starmer's going to be to the right of them on quite a lot of issues, but actually they could easily overlap. So in my view, it's not impossible that the Labour and Liberal Democrats will synchronise manifestos behind the scenes before the next general election. I think that's entirely possible that might happen. So what does all this mean for socialists? And I'll wrap up with this. I've got 6 points, yeah? Very quick points. My first point is that we're going to continue to live through a continued period of political turbulence domestically, rising inequality, environmental crisis, destruction of the public realm. What was left of the public realm will be sold off. I think that's just inevitable now. We're going to be living in a period where there's going to be preparation for more international global conflict and military struggle. And part of this turbulence will be the completion, I think, of the Third Way project, transforming the Labour Party into a US-style Democrat Party, meaning austerity at home and war abroad. The fourth point is that the question of political representation for the working class will become ever more acute and require an answer as expulsions from Labour continue and fragmentary groups of working class and socialist politics develop in towns and cities.
You're being so immature.
Excuse me. Hey, Warren, thanks for coming. Listen, I wasn't trying to stick my nose in, but we weren't. It's fine. Oi, get in.
Glenn, can you turn your TV off, please? Sorry about that, Will. I don't know.
Don't worry. I can't get myself going again. That was an unusual intervention. I thought I'd really upset somebody. And so the question of political representation for the working class will become ever more acute and will require an answer as expulsions from Labour continue and you get these fragmentary groups of working class and socialist politics developing in towns and cities across the country. Because whether Labour wins or more likely forms a coalition with the Liberal Democrats, its role as the sole representative of Labour, in my view, historically, is ending. Whoever governs after 2024, and the post-war settlement is going to be demolished. Now, to my mind, two related processes should be encouraged to unfold from here on in. The first is a debate in the workers' movement about political representation. We have to have that discussion. And the second is the drawing together of Marxists, both to engage in that debate and being a tribune for it, and to work around unifying particularly independent Marxists, but we want as many Marxists in the fold as we can get, so we can encourage this development. And I think it's better we begin this process now and do it sooner rather than later.
Thank you very much, Will, for that extremely interesting and well thought out introduction. And I welcome all of those that have joined while Will's been speaking and perhaps missed my introductory remarks. I just want to go through a few points before I open it up and invite people to speak. First of all, we're live streamed on Facebook, and secondly, this meeting is being recorded, so please bear that in mind. Secondly, we have a policy of trying to encourage as much discussion and debate as possible, and so to do that, we limit people to 3 minutes initially. So after 3 minutes, I'll just ask you to stop. So better if you stop before I ask you. And then if we've got time, obviously we'll be able to go around for a second round, and hopefully the debate or the discussion will continue. But we want to try and get as many people in, and in that vein, then I just encourage people to put your hands up, either like this or using the yellow hand, and fire away. Don't, obviously when I call you in, But if you've got a question or a point that you think might be controversial, don't hold back. We like debate and we like discussion. So with that in mind, can I see that Caroline Minnie has got her hand up. Have we got anybody else who wants to come in? Okay, so I'm going to call in Minnie, and then I did see Matthew, but he's disappeared. So Minnie, fire away, please.
Yeah, thanks for that, Will. I thought that was really interesting analysis, etc. And I saw someone say in social media after local elections that the media obviously restricts what people get to know or what they can focus on. And they didn't mention the fact that the Greens doubled their seats in this election. And when UKIP only had, what, a few seats, a handful, and then they were getting more, it was all over the news. I think what Will says about the third way is really interesting and awful at the same time. And I agree that we need to set out Marxist principles, you know, a working class party movement. I agree with that. I agree about the Liverpool. They call themselves socialists, but there isn't. They're not actually putting things forward. But Will's last point in particular on the private sphere, not so much public. If you look at Teesside and the local mayor, is it the Metro Mayor, Ben Houchen, is it the free ports that are going on now? And we've got one in Liverpool now. They cleared, it has environmental disaster and disaster for, it's ratcheting up capitalism on steroids. Well, you know, we've always got that. They dredged what they did was they cleared some land of toxic, you know, old industrial land of toxic chemicals. They dumped it in the mouth of the river, and they also dredged the river. And so there's dead starfish, there's dead fish washing up on beaches. There's an environmental disaster now. Local fisher people have lost their, you know, they can't do that. Also, they sold a piece of land for £100, I think, to a private company, and it was worth 100 million. So they've made loads and loads of money. So, and because these companies, they can hide behind confidentiality as well. So it's just, we really do have to watch out. We've got that coming to Liverpool now. It's really frightening what's going on. And free ports, and don't know too much about charter cities, but they're going to have different rules where trade union regulations and rules, you know, they won't be able to have trade union representation. There's so much at stake here, so much at stake. And then we've got our NHS as well, with the integrated care accountable American system that's coming actually, and it's privatizing our NHS, ratcheted up. They already have the system in place for charging. As we know, Labour's going to use the private sector. I've got to go now. Okay, thanks. Yeah. Bye.
Thanks, Minnie. That's great. I've got Matthew Jones, followed by Steve Forrest. Okay, so Matthew.
Yeah, I just want to say, obviously I'm in Glasgow. There weren't any elections in Scotland, but it is interesting to see what's happening here in those terms, and in terms of what's happening for the Labour Party in particular. I think first of all, one thing we should always bear in mind, of course, is that the level of class struggle and the strikes are continuing. There's actually a PCS are out for 4 weeks just up the road here, which is interesting. It's the first long-term strike I've seen, but it is also going beyond the bits of the old either state or former state outfits like Royal Mail and so on. It's now beginning to seep into the private sector as well. So we're now seeing a series of private sector strikes, including in there's been two disputes in hospitality in pubs and restaurants and so on in Glasgow in recent times. So yeah, that's starting to happen as well. I think that in those terms, what you're seeing is a decay of the SNP, which have been obviously the dominant force in Scotland for the last 20 odd years. and through the whole business of the leadership exploding, as people will have seen, and the sort of the fact that it's now been revealed that of course they're all at it, and there's now a police investigation, despite the fact that the police Scotland, of course, is intimately tied in. And even the Procurator Fiscal's office, the prosecuting office, is intimately tied into the machinery of the SNP. I mean, anywhere else, any other sort of in normal country, it might be called corrupt, but here it's sort of appears to be normal. So yeah, there's this ongoing investigation of SNP. So that's had an effect. The SNP vote has gone down from about, it's was polling in the middle 40s, which gave them a total domination, a total lock. And that's now gone down to like the middle 30s. At the same time, obviously, the Tories have been discredited by their own, the Truss business, and the fact that they don't have any credible leaders in Scotland. Ruth Davidson was the only person in Scotland with any kind of ability to attract a vote. And she's gone. So what you're seeing is the Labour Party has basically managed to get itself up to around about the 30% mark, or maybe just over, from around about the 20% mark, which means that it could get some seats, because obviously with that movement, and you can see this if you go and look at actually John Curtis's own website, which is called What Scotland Thinks. He tracks.
Matthew.
Okay, he tracks all the polls in Scotland on all the subjects. It's brilliant, because he is obviously a stratified academic. So yeah, well worth watching. All right, thanks.
Thank you very much. Really interesting about the Scottish perspective. I've got Steve, Forrest, and then Janet. So Steve.
Thanks very much. Excellent introduction, Will. Very broad-based, covering many issues. And I think for me, if you look at the results, I mean, yeah, the experts, the John Curtis and these people are experts. But I think if you look back at the 1995 local council elections, Blair polled 47% of the vote. John Major, 25%. Blair won 1,807 councillors. And the Tories lost 2018. There was a further election, but in less areas in 96, where Blair polled 43%, the Lib Dems 26 under Ashdown, the Tories 29, losing a further 607 seats, literally almost wiped out. Now, for me, we all know the politics around this, but that is a government in waiting. That Tony Blair, at that point, after those two council elections, is a government in waiting. This is not a government in waiting. This is, at best, I think your analysis was very good, Will. At best, this is a hung parliament. Possibly they might try some of the manoeuvres that you mentioned behind the scenes with not standing candidates or not emphasising in the blue wall and the red wall and these type of things. But for me, I mean, if you take the Turkish election yesterday, the opposition in Turkey, I mean, probably have a discussion on this in one of these meetings maybe, but the Turkish opposition was supposed to win on the first ballot, right? And the incumbent, Erdogan, has managed to lead going into a runoff. Joe Biden, a similar thing. He was supposed to be engulfed by a red wall and incumbent. Bolsonaro in Brazil was supposed to be an incumbent waiting to be overturned by Lula. I mean, the victory party was celebrated. I know Lula won, but the vote it went to the second round. It was 51-49. What I see here is the potential that Tory voters are A, not coming out in these elections. B, if they are, that when they speak into the pollsters, like in those elections I've just mentioned there, they're not coming and saying they're voting Tory. If they then come out and vote Tory because that's their natural home, I think this potential of a hung parliament could be in danger, and we could be looking at Neil Kinnock and a disaster for the Labour Party and the Labour movement, despite all of the internal actions. Nick's given me the whirl. I'll hopefully come back and discuss your other issues about manifestos and stuff like that, but I'll leave those points for now. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Steve. That was spot on in time, and very interesting. So, Janet, you're next.
Yeah, I largely agree with what Will was saying about the future. So I don't want to talk about that particularly. Just a few little points about the local elections. I suppose the first point is that usually we can't really extrapolate what's going to happen in a general election from what happens in local elections. I mean, it really depends. I mean, there's a very low turnout. It depends who is being elected, you know, which councils, there are local factors and so on. But I think Stephen's right about just occasionally you can do that. And I think, you know, I don't know if, I think I probably stood in that election when Blair was, you know, won in the next round, the next general election. I think there was a different feeling. So I certainly agree that, you know, whatever Starmer's saying about this is, you know, leading us to a majority. We all know he's lying. We know he knows he's lying, and it's not going to happen, I don't think, a hung parliament. But I think there's one counterpoint about that. And what I didn't really understand what Will said, he said one of his context points was the growing unpopularity of Brexit. That's true, I suppose, generally in the country. But where Labour actually did well was in those seats, many of those seats where there were elections where they lost to the Tories because of the push for the second referendum. And in all of those, Labour actually did quite well. And they, you know, in, I don't want to call them the Red Wall, but I suppose that's what they are. And I don't, so, you know, maybe Starmer, however dire, dreadful and terrible he is, maybe his team got it right about his, you know, U-turn on Brexit. It seems to have actually worked. And I think, I don't know if it'll work in a general election. Who knows in a year's time? Who knows who stayed at home? Who knows who switched? Who knows? But I think we must get a glimmer of what did happen in those seats, because I can't see any other reason for Labour doing better there than they did in other areas. I think looking at something like the Greens, they did really well. They were getting votes from both Labour and the Tories, I think, because they were getting votes in rural Tory areas. And I don't think a lot of that was tactical voting. I think some of it was actually switching. But, you know, we don't really know. So I think that's what I really wanted to say about the local elections. I mean, there were some very interesting local results.
10 seconds, Janet.
I entirely agree with what people said about the Liverpool independence, but they were good results, though.
That's great, Janet. Thank you very much. Spot on time again. So I think we're going to be able to come round for a second round, but I've got Gary and then Richard.
Thanks, Nick. And thanks, Will, for a very interesting, thought-provoking introduction. A couple of sort of spot thoughts, and then I'll give some more general reflections. What you said, Will, about the war and Starmer supporting the war was certainly true, obviously. You seem to be suggesting that if that is stopping him be bolder about making investment and in public services and the like, and actually dealing with the cost of living crisis. I'm quite skeptical about the extent to which the war has actually caused the cost of living crisis, to be honest. I think there are some much deeper, far-ranging factors worldwide that have caused the cost of living crisis than just the war. So I'm not sure that ending the war would sort things out in that kind of way. I think, and I think it's a far more kind of ideological reason why Starmer is not advocating being more adventurous with capital. The other thing, I agree with Janet, actually, that I think that for Starmer now to switch and say that he wants to seek to join the EU again would seriously be electoral suicide. You know, people can express sentiments in opinion polls about how they're regretting Brexit, but the moment somebody actually stuck their head above the parapet in a serious party that was vying for government and said, we are campaigning to rejoin the EU, there would be an outcry across the country. It would be seen as being highly undemocratic. So I think I disagree with that as well. But I think you're certainly right that Starmer is struggling to establish dominance electorally. and he certainly isn't a government in waiting. But I kind of feel that the prognosis of what's likely to happen that you give is, well, simultaneously very depressing, and it kind of, in a sense, it shouldn't need saying, but I know there are plenty of people on the left who do think it's good if Starmer fails, or if the Labour Party fails, and if the Labour Party does badly. It is disastrous for us. It's disastrous for the working class if the Labour doesn't get a resounding victory in the general election. Right? It is critical that we do have that. It will undermine the confidence of the class, no end. And if Starmer is successful in turning the Labour Party into something that it's never been in its entire history, as in the third way or whatever we call it, then that would also be disastrous, because it will be the end of the Labour Party without a serious fight, without a rupture, without a major exodus and split within the party between the left and the right of the party, right? So I actually think that is a very depressing scenario, and I hope one that
10 seconds.
Oh my God, barely started. Okay, I'll come back then.
Come back next time.
I will.
That's your 3 minutes.
Sure.
Okay, sorry, Gary. Richard Brenner.
Well, I'm really good at being brief, so I'll be all right. Look, I think I mean I agree with what Will said, and I agree with a lot of what Gary said as well. Actually, not necessarily on Brexit. The one question I've got for Will is that is if we assume that the cost of living crisis is going to get worse, if we assume that the recession is going to get worse, then of course the Tories are in a terrible mess, and it makes it much harder for them to recover. But what if, and this is just a what if, I don't know, but what if the real guts of the crisis was affected during COVID? What if the devaluation of capital that would normally take place in the trade industrial cycle took place in COVID, and actually we're in a relatively soft landing, and prices are going to start to come down, and interest rates are going to start to come down? I don't think they necessarily are, but what if? Second point that I've got is that I thought that Will's analysis of how Labour did better but isn't dominant was compelling. We've got a very managerialist view in the Labour Party. We've got a Labour leader who makes Ed Balls look like Peter Kropotkin as far as his attitude towards managerialism and a complete absence of political direction is concerned. And we've seen, therefore, a very muted revival. On the other hand, and it was really helpful that Will traced it, we saw quite interesting set of results from the left. So the real issue I've got is that we need to think about is whether the question of organising the left in the context of the Labour Party looking clearly for some sort of alliance with the Lib Dems, the SNP, the Greens at one level. They won't say it openly, but they're obviously trying to put it together. Whether we can try to present to the left wing of the Labour movement the idea of coming together in some sort of political initiative. Now, I don't think it's going to be fundamentally around the elections and lost deposits that is going to coalesce, personally. But I still think that the absence of a left alternative is very obvious. And the Marxist left can ask ourselves the question, do we want to try to bring a new party into being alongside a load of disappointed people that are disappointed in the Labour Party and strikers that are disappointed in the way things are going with the industrial disputes at the moment? Or should we stand to one side and try to build something pristine? And my sense is that we need to try to bring people together and influence the outcome.
Richard, I'm going to have to ask you to stop there. Thanks.
I have stopped.
Okay. Howard.
Right. It's the same sort of subject were raised last week as now. I think you should have a special discussion on it, really. It's like, you know, what is social democracy? What is its function in capitalism? I mean, one or two stated I did that it's a counter-revolutionary party. It exists to manage capitalism and to keep the working class under control for exploitation. It's as simple as that. The crisis of capitalism just keeps deepening and deepening and sharpening, and in that framework, Labour just becomes more and more reactionary. I think with the witch hunt, what was happening there was that it was a nationally organised left wing of a kind, and the ruling class said we can no longer have a nationally organised left wing of any kind. So they instructed the right wing of the Labour Party leadership to just completely smash the left and expel it, scatter it, and so on. But not only that, once that was done, well, to go back a little bit, a lot of people don't like this idea because they're kind of squeamish. But the reality is that if you're a professional bourgeois politician on £100,000 a year, you know what's going on at the top level because you have to. So that witch hunt was brewing for quite some time. Corbyn and all the left leaders knew it was happening, and they never said so. Hello?
Yeah, sorry, Howard. Richard wasn't muted. I've muted him.
All right. So I would like someone to say that they're a naive person, and they truly think that Corbyn and co did not know that witch hunt was brewing, that Starmer and a small number of people were able to keep it completely secret amongst half a dozen people and then spring it on the world, and Corbyn didn't know about it. Well, that's ridiculous. All those left leaders knew that witch hunt was brewing. And I said, well, why didn't they state it? And it's simple. If they'd have warned the ranks in advance, then they would have made a drive at the right, and they wouldn't have been able to smash that left-wing movement in there. It would be impossible. And so the only option left to the right would be to actually split the party, because that had to be achieved. That left-wing movement had to be smashed. That program had to be smashed, which would then mean that a new party would have to be formed. And Corbyn and those left leaders just did not want any of that to happen. So they kept their mouths shut. And then when it was launched, they still didn't do anything about it. They just let it proceed. And that has like hugely demoralized the ranks of the left in the Labour Party.
You have to wind up now, Howard.
200,000 left the party. And as far as I can see, all that left wing are finished. They're demoralized.
Okay, I'm sure you'll have an opportunity to come back in again. Thanks very much. Is there anybody who hasn't spoken yet who wants to, make a contribution, however brief, ask a question? Just put your hand up or indicate with the yellow hand. If not, what I'm going to do is I'm going to invite Will to come back for a few minutes to take up one or two of the points and try and push the discussion along.
Okay. So just to pick up on some points, and I will try and push the discussion along because I think it's come up twice now, the point I want to refer to. But the first one is, I think what was being said about free ports, charter cities, all that stuff, that will be mainstream Labour programme if they're in government. I think it'd be very hard to find a difference between them and Sunak, really. And I think that's just all coming down the line, and we're in for a very difficult period. Can I just say, in terms of the Brexit stuff, what I wasn't meaning was that he should or could, by bringing it up. I don't think he can. It's impossible for the reasons that people state, that it would be disastrous for him. But I think there is a price that he will pay with lots of the people's vote people in the Labour Party and people who are not members of the party but might vote for it. I think they'll go elsewhere. And I think that's a big problem for him, actually. If sentiment around Brexit is so high, I think a lot of people might accept that we're not going to get another referendum and that it would be a bad idea. But that doesn't feel that they won't look at Starmer and say, you were the people's vote person. I mean, the dishonesty that was involved in that from him is as big as the rest of the stuff, really. The other point is about the war and the cost of living. I mean, I agree with you. The cost of living stuff is a more globalized phenomenon than just the Ukraine war, when there's profiteering and all that kind of stuff going on. But I think that people will feel that the war is costing them economically. He's unable to offer anything more than something, marginal in order to help out in terms of cost of living, because he's trying to be fiscally prudent. And I think that cuts him off from a whole series of arguments. So I think he's boxed himself in through his previous politics, is the point I was making. Not that he could or should do other stuff. The issue about the Red Wall, I agree, but I think that Labour will win seats. I don't think they won't win any. I think they probably win about 90 or so, and they will be Red Wall seats in some areas where you would expect them to win, actually, or hope that they would win. But the point I really want to introduce into the discussion is, finally, Richard, about the soft landing. I think they might be able to engineer a soft landing to a certain degree. I really do. And I think the Tories will work on that. But the point I was really interested in is people saying what a disaster it would be for the working class if Labour loses the next election. Yeah. Now, what does that mean for us in terms of tactics and what socialists and Marxists do in the next election? I'd be really interested in hearing people's thoughts on that. Are we saying that nobody should stand against Labour because it's absolutely crucial that Labour wins? Are we saying that the tactics should be employed where we stand against Labour, where they're likely to win, actually, but we want to make a political point? I mean, what are people saying about that? What should socialists and Marxists do in that context? And I'd be very interested to hear people's thoughts on that. I'd be also interested to hear people's thoughts on, okay, even if one accepts that actually 18 months to a general election is a very tall order to get any kind of platform together, what process are we involved in historically? Do people agree that Starmer's going to take the Labour Party over the threshold and turn it into a democratic-like party? And there won't be a big split, there'll be a soft split. And what do we do about that?
Very good points there, Will, to come back and develop the discussion. I don't know if any of the comrades like Gary or others that raise those points want to come back and develop those or to say anything further. Is there anybody that wants to come back in at the moment? Gary.
Well, I would like to come back in again, Nick, but not unless anybody who hasn't spoken yet. Only if people who haven't spoken yet don't want to come in.
Sure. Well, we do try to encourage people to speak. So we've got quite a few new people at this meeting. So don't hesitate to put your hand up and make a contribution, even if it's just a question. It all helps to making a good discussion and airing views, different views. But while people are thinking about that, Gary, I'm going to come back.
Right. Thanks. I just didn't want to jump
Sure.
in over people. So thanks, Will. Those important clarifications of what you've been saying about Brexit and about the war, and I agree with what you're saying there. What I was going to go on to say after I'd said how disastrous that prognosis was to say, actually, I'm not sure we're at that point yet where Starmer is going to be in a position where he can wipe out the sort of working class politics from the Labour Party. We've been round and round this circle for 120 odd years, right? And I don't get the impression right now that he is in a position of strength to be quite so victorious, even though he's expelled the left from the party, largely the hard left anyway. I don't think he has carried the party with him, even though he's got rid of lots of us, including me. If you look at the draft sort of manifesto, come the collation of policy documents that was leaked this last week, actually the policies that are in there, and I know they're not going to end up in the election manifesto, right? I know that the leadership will prune them left, right, and centre, but nonetheless, these are policies that have come out of the policy forums. And the policy forums are notoriously controlled by the centrists. and by the bureaucracy. Nonetheless, what looked like fairly traditional kind of left, okay, social democratic, but nonetheless left policies are in that manifesto at this stage. And that reflects something about what's going on in the party right now. I think that the party is not bought into the idea of having an American-style democratic party, and that battle is yet to be fought. So even though I'm not in the party, I'm still kind of got at least 1.5 eyes on what's going on in the party, because I don't think it's decided yet. The other side to it, I think, is when we look at those results, and it was really interesting, Will, you doing that survey of sort of left candidates across the country. I think, as always, there is a real case to be made and real opportunities to be had around local specific circumstances. So in Leicester, they did really well. They didn't do anywhere near well enough to win anything, right, significantly, but they did still do really well because of the local circumstances. In Liverpool, they did really, really well, but again, because of local circumstances. I think the Tusk results are on the upper end of normal for socialist independent candidates. I don't think they should prove any kind of significant break from the past 30, 40 years in terms of the viability of standing outside the party. So my own view is actually, yes, where we got specific situations that we can stand and fight locally, we should do that. And in some cases, maybe even just purely for propaganda purposes, we should stand against the Labour Party. But it's not going to be the major feature of the next election, that's for sure. And I think that, regrettably, we've got battles to be fought around the parties for some time to come. Thanks.
Gary, thanks very much. I'm going to call in Soraya because I know you've got to get off for work. So, Soraya.
Thanks. Just very quickly, I wanted to say I am going to have to go, and but how much I'm enjoying the discussion and how important it is that we're having these discussions, because there's so much going on, and it's really helpful to me to actually hear and exchange views on what's happening. I also, and I know I don't need to do this because I'm not chairing, but Chris is having problems with his mic, and he's raised some questions in the chat. So just to draw that to, oh, and I've got a thumbs up, so great. On that note, thank you very much, everybody, and see you soon, hopefully.
Yeah, well, I was going to see if Chris could come in, but if you've still got, difficulties using your mic, Chris? I'm assuming that silence is yes, you do. So I'm going to read it out because it's an issue that's come up, and it's an ongoing discussion. So Chris Strafford from Manchester says, we've been through halfway houses now for decades. We've all been through them. They've all been disasters. It is not a question of being pristine, but what is actually viable. If you have no confidence in Marxism, then we can try and do another Labour Party or some ill-defined anti-capitalist party. Or, if you think our ideas are relevant and have compelling answers after Corbynism or following the strikes, then we should win those workers to a Marxist organisation and programme. Apologies for no mic or video, and it might be that I missed an earlier. Okay, earlier. So I missed Chris's first comment, sorry. So that was the second comment. The earlier one says, apologies, I don't have my mic or video working on this machine. I largely agree with Will. Starmer and co are intent on making any last vestiges of Corbynism and pretense of being a working class party. Yeah, the Labour left look utterly defeated, and for the most part, the trade union leadership seems happy with the direction of travel. We see regularly that the bureaucracy and the Labour leadership working in tandem to undermine the strikes that appear to be petering out. I think Will was right to say Tusk et al. Did relatively well, and that we should consider their small intervention as something to emulate on, but with clear Marxist politics. I wonder what comrades think about standing explicitly communist candidates in the next election. It is something candidates, it is something comrades in Manchester have been discussing over the last couple of months. Okay, so that's a very interesting and I think pertinent contribution to the discussion, and it's something that I tend to agree with. I'm more inclined, well, let me put it clearly. I agree with what Chris has said there, and I'll try to come in a bit later on if there's time. But I can see hands up from people that have spoken before. I've got Matthew, Steve, Howard, and Richard again. But again, can I just make a plea? Is there anybody that's not spoken who wants to come in before I call people in for a second time? Okay, so I'm going to go back to Matthew then, please. 3 minutes.
Okay, right, North Scotland. I think that the interesting thing actually in these parts has been, obviously the actual crisis of political organisation. I mean, if you look at the Labour Party in this city, it's never been that big, and the same in Scotland actually. I mean, historically the Communist Party was bigger than the Labour Party in this city, and the effect of Corbynism actually, of course, was quite muted in Scotland. I mean, it did increase some thousands, but you're looking at a Labour Party in all Scotland that was less than, that never made any 20,000. And what's happened now, what's interesting, of course, is the effect, obviously, of the 2014 referendum and campaign was to massively increase the membership of the SNP, and the effect of the left collapsing internationalism, and a whole series of organisations collapsed internationalism, whether that's the SWP, the various fragments of the militant, all of them collapsed internationalism. The bits of the fraction bits of the SWP around Banbury and so on and so forth, it created the RIC. So basically all of those people functioned essentially as recruiting sergeants for the SNP. So actually what happened out of that was the SNP membership went up to in excess of 100,000 people. I mean, it's, in those terms, I mean, a huge organisation, I mean, far larger, much, probably 6 times the size of Labour Party in Scotland. And one of the largest political parties in the country, only covered over by the growth of Corbynism in the rest of the country. So the point being is that what's happening now, of course, is that's actually in the state of collapse. Now, not only have you got the situation where the program of the Labour Party essentially now in all of the country is to cut out the entire membership from any serious decision making. Whether particularly obviously candidates, but also other policy and so on and so forth. That is why David Evans is General Secretary of the Labour Party, because his programme, as he has said, is to make sure that people, the membership of the Labour Party has no influence on what it does. And so you get basically now what you're getting is all the candidates, or most of the candidates in Scotland are being imposed one way or another. And actually, the SEC has allowed the guy who's a racist and neo-fascist to stand, and the guy who's standing in Rutherglen has been imposed, and so no local members will campaign for it. At the same time, the SNP, the membership has collapsed by 30,000. So I mean, there's a crisis, enormous crisis, political crisis in those terms. Thanks,
Matthew. Thank you very much, Richard. Richard.
Hello, sorry, I just had to unmute. I just wanted to reply to Chris because he's right that we don't need a halfway house or another reformist party, and that we need a mass working class Marxist party. But there are 2 sides to this. The first is that we have the tradition of Labourism that has prevented that. And the other side of this is that we have the tradition of the way that Marxists have organised in Britain, which Marx himself opposed, he lived here, and he opposed it, the tradition of Henry Hyndman and the SDF, which is the genealogical, spiritual and political father of the entire British left. And that is the tradition of the sect, which focuses on propaganda and which does not seek to organise and agitate to bring together a mass political organisation, but instead seeks to establish itself as a propaganda sect and win ones and twos to it. And the whole problem is that we have right now very large numbers of people that can see the need for an alternative to the Labour Party, and we need to intersect with them. We need to meet them at the point at which they say they need and they want a political alternative. We need to organise them. We need to agitate in favour of bringing such a party into being. And we need to attempt to saturate all the layers of people that agree with us about that with an understanding of the doctrine, the strategy, the tactics, the programme, and the ideas of revolutionary Marxism. And we need to do all of those things. And it's very difficult to do all of those things at the same time, but we must do all of those things. If we don't, then the reformists will win, because whatever new force to the left of Labour is constituted will be done by others. And our job, and this, by the way, is how every other mass revolutionary party was ever formed in history, was not simply by establishing a sect which said, here is the answer, join us, but by trying to organise masses of workers around a policy and win them to it at the same time. To win people to the idea of working class political independence and to the policies and strategy of Marxism at the same time. It is self-defeating for us to say we will not attempt to build a mass working class party until such time as we've built a little group that has X many thousand members, because we will only build a large Marxist organisation if we are simultaneously attempting to organise large numbers of workers in the fight for a political alternative. Done.
Thank you very much, Richard. I'm going to call in Steve Forrest.
Thanks very much, Nick. I think this will be an ongoing debate as to new party, old party, which version of a new party type thing. Just like, I think it's very apt to remind ourselves that last week or the week before now was also the 40th anniversary of the election of the Liverpool City Council and the makeup of that. So it's all very well to discuss standing candidates and getting 300 votes or 4.2% and making sort of bold socialist case. But for me, it is a wider conversation. But I think the main point is that, you know, we're best placed, following on from Richard's comments, I think we're best placed to do that, having fought within the party as best we can for ideas of socialism. That brings me to my main point that I wanted to make in relation to Will's opening remarks, is that I think he's right. I think there will be a battle. There will be this whole question of potentially, as far as Starmer can, attempting to make it into a Democratic Party Mark II and the third way and all this and everything else. But I think the main thing we have to understand from our point of view is we're not passive in that debate. Yeah, we are not passive in that debate. We're not looking at it from a passive sense. We're looking at it that we are engaged in that debate. And I think Gary is absolutely correct that we are engaged in that debate. If we're in the Labour Party, we can be engaged in that debate to whatever level that is currently enabling us to do. In our trade unions, we can be. On our platforms, in articles, on our trades councils, in any other forum, we from meetings like this, and I think that's why these meetings are so healthy and so important, to discuss ideas, to discuss a program, to discuss an alternative to the third way, an alternative to clause 4 on steroids. We can put that and we can start winning people to those ideas because we're not passive in that debate. So I think it's really important that we understand that, appreciate that, and start putting that into practice, because through that we can win a whole layer of workers and youth over to these discussions on the basis that we are not passive in that particular debate. And just ending on 2 sentences, Blair probably wanted the third way and the US Democratic Party more than Starmer does. I think Gary's right on that, and he never got it. In fact, he ended up with Ken Jackson using the block vote to block Ken Livingstone, and went back to very old traditional Labour ways of blocking people. And I disagree with what Richard's put up there, but anyway, that's for another day. But thank you very much. Cheers.
Thanks very much, Steve. That one of the main reasons, and hopefully we'll continue it for these discussions, is precisely to have a debate and a discussion, and oops, you had a few more seconds, Steve, but to air the differences and to have a debate, because the left has been pushed so far back that we need a space to discuss. I'm going to call in Howard, then I'm going to take 3 minutes myself, and we'll see who else wants to come in. So Howard. Howard? Howard, you need to unmute yourself.
How's that?
There you go. Fantastic.
I've got a lot of agreement with what Richard Brenner said about just like a propaganda sect. You need to have both of them, ideas and action combined. So that's the perspective of what a party would have, would be to be involved in every kind of campaigning movement, whether it's racism, sexism, and so on, as well, obviously, as in the trade unions and setting up new community organizations. But so you can have that as the longer term perspective, which is necessary. But the question is how do we get there now? Holding up one or two sort of communist candidates, we said, well, how can it, if there's about 20 people, it's pointless. So the whole perspective has got to be about regrouping the left. This is a contentious issue, but I think that 95% of the former Labour left is destroyed. It's not responding to anything. They may talk left in a pub, but that's it. They're just afraid of losing that party card, or they've been left or expelled in disgust. And like the whole mentality is Labour Party-ism. They're not really into this kind of a thing. So maybe 5% of the former left of the Labour Party is viable in terms of like action, tenacity, and so on. So what you're really looking at is new forces, and it has to be from amongst the strikers. The most angry of the strikers, students, working class youth, have to be regrouped along with that 5% or so from the former Labour left before you can build a party. So you have to do that first, is regrouping the left. So the question that needs to be addressed is, well, how do we regroup the left, including these new forces? Along that road, you can discuss what a party must be, you know, what it's going to do and so on. But you do have to regroup the left. So I think you really do need a major discussion on that, because 20 people putting up hardcore communist candidates or whatever is pointless, because like you're 20 people. In Liverpool, where they did what they did, they had a lot of people organized into that in various ways. So they had it concentrated. But, you know, obviously they have no means of doing that, projecting that onto a national scale. So it's about regrouping the left, and that's what you've got to do. I think what you have to do is set out a basic program and then leaflet the strikers and the militant students and working class youth. And then you hold local meetings to do that. Once you've leafleted and so on, you then hold local meetings.
Thanks very much, Howard. So I'm going to come in myself. I've timed myself for 3 minutes. I think the discussion is really, really interesting, and it's complex, and it's inevitable that we're going to have quite big disagreements. And I think it's always important to start from the position of, well, what's the most important thing, because the tactics then flow from that. It seems to me that the most important thing is that we need to fight for socialist policies. I mean, when I use the term socialist, I mean communist, in the way that Chris Strafford has raised them. I don't differentiate between the two terms. I'm talking about a program for the revolutionary transformation of society, and we've been pushed back and back and back, and so we really need to be confident about arguing that corner inside the Labour movement. So yes, we've been pushed back, and there are relatively few. There are some groups, and in my opinion, it is correct to call for those groups, as Howard has just said, to regroup, to discuss merging. I don't think any of them will do it for all sorts of reasons that we'll have to go into on another occasion, but I think it is the right call. But if we've been pushed far further and further back, I don't think Chris, and certainly not I, none of us who are talking about organizing around Marxist ideas are talking about just having a propaganda sect. We want to intervene in issues, whether that's strikes or other sorts of movements, as communists, and try to recruit people, particularly young people, to the ideas of communism. The tactics in terms of the electoral sphere, it seems to me, are very, very difficult. It's clear that I agree with Will, what he was saying about Tusk. I've looked at their material. There's no real call for socialism in that. And I wonder about all the effort and energy and resources that are put into standing candidates where you don't even put your socialist alternative. So you're not really building an alternative to Labour from a socialist point of view. You're really got a programme for local government. And I think there are going to be struggles inside the Labour Party. The trade unions are not going to leave this side of a general election. There might be battles. So we've got to find a way of organising both inside the party, if we can, and outside of the party, trying to find people that might agree with us about communism or are interested in discussing with us about communism. And that means reaching out to people that have left in despair or demoralisation and talking about a new party, and those that have been in the strikes and want to have a more combative movement. And I'm going to stop there because I don't want to abuse my position. Sorry. Thanks. So who's next? I think Paul. Paul, you had your hand up. You still there?
Yes, it was just a short point. Someone was talking earlier, it might have been Howard, but he seemed a bit dismissive about getting what might be 20 people elected. But on that point, I kind of think, well, if those people get elected, then that's all very good. My point is to try not to be negative, and every political grouping has got to start somewhere. And my issue for a long time, no disrespect for people, obviously I was a member of the Labour Party for over 20 years, and obviously waiting for someone like Corbyn to come along throughout that entire time. And then it finally happened, and then I left the week after David Evans was formally ratified as the General Secretary. I felt then that the game was up for the left of the Labour Party at that point. And even before then, I realised, looking through Labour Party history, it was never a socialist party anyway. It was a social democratic party at best. Basically, and also what I was going to say was some of these newer parties like Breakthrough and Northern Independent parties and so on, they're well aware of the problems of first past the post. So in many constituencies, they are trying to work with other parties so that they don't stand against each other. In the past, that appears that it never really happened in the past, but it appears to be happening now. So any move, even if it's just a few MPs to start with, the Labour Party started that way initially when it eventually became an electoral vehicle. It couldn't be dismissed. It's about, obviously, it's ultimately about what your programme is, ultimately. But any move in that direction should be welcome. Thanks.
Thanks, Paul. Okay. I'm going to make a further plea to anybody that's not spoken yet. If you've got any questions or you want to make a longer contribution, please don't hold back. Is there anybody that's not spoken who wants to speak? No. Okay. I'm going to take my second bite at the apple, if I may, before I call Will back finally. It's quite clear looking at different postings on Facebook and all the different sort of what I call the Corbynite groups, that there's a lot of confusion about what sort of party people are calling for. There's one group particularly that's sole purpose is to stand against Starmer and to defeat Starmer, which seems to me to be, whilst understandable, completely futile waste of time. Because if Starmer's defeated, it will just go to Wes Streeting or somebody of similar ilk. However hard it is to contemplate, it seems to me, those of us that believe that we need a complete transformation of society have to start somewhere. And that doesn't mean that we cut ourselves off from people that don't agree with us or think that the Corbyn programme was adequate or sufficient. I don't think it was. And I don't think that we should be trying to recreate that. We need to go beyond that. And we need to have discussions about why it was inadequate. But if we're going to do that, we need, as Marxists, to discuss what we think, how we put forward those ideas. And obviously, we need to be active. We need to take action. We need to think about putting out a leaflet when we've got the resources to intervene, to try to win people to our ideas and engage in the debates that are taking place all over the country amongst left-wingers that have been kicked out or left the Labour Party about what sort of party we need. And where there are steps in that direction, we obviously need to be part of that discussion. But I think we also have to be, have a sense of proportion about what we can do. Personally, I've got my doubts about standing in elections unless it's really part of a party project. That's the real point at an early stage of a communist movement, is standing not to expect to win, but to build the party. And so that's the way that I'm looking at electoral interventions in the near future. But those are my 3 minutes, and I'm going to ask Will now. He's got the very difficult task of replying to what was a very broad and interesting discussion with different opinions. So Will, I'm going to give you 10 minutes.
Blimey, I'm not sure I've got 10 minutes in me after that.
Okay, well, don't take them all.
Yeah, really interesting discussion, and I really appreciate kind of people being able to express different points of view and having just teasing out ideas, because it's been really useful for me actually. One of the places I want to start is, and maybe this is yet another discussion, is people's assessment of what's happened to Corbyn's base. Because I think if you, and I'm not sure is my answer, but I think if you look at the various websites that have been set up around Corbyn, or Akisa and some of the other websites, it is quite, I think it is quite tragic in the sense that everything was focused around Corbyn, and rather than even his left-wing social democratic politics, funnily enough. And I think a lot of people are really, really disorientated because of what happened to him, and don't really get, I think, what's happened to him, other than Starmer is not a very nice person and we have to stand against him in his constituency. But I can't imagine for the life of me, as Howard was saying, in a way, I can't imagine that maybe Howard said 5% weren't burnt out. I can't imagine that they're not, that they're all burnt out, they're all useless. There's absolutely no way of reaching these people because of the experience they've had. I would like to take a time out on that and for us to do some analysis and think about it, because when I was involved in the Corbyn movement, there were a lot of really experienced political people who've been around for a long time who had a political analysis, but a lot of us, I think, felt that we got it wrong and are thinking about what to do next. So I don't think it's a question of just confusion. I think it's actually people standing back thinking, right, what am I going to do next and how do I do it? Yeah, and with who and who do I do it with? I think with regard to the Labour Party as a kind of a party which has bourgeois politics but with workers in it, let me put it that way. In a way, I think a lot of my thinking is influenced by Blairism, yeah, and what's happened around the experience of Blairism. And that I felt from 94 onwards, over a period of until really 2001, that effectively, like the socialist left was just being squashed, anathematized and silenced, and they were trying to squeeze socialist politics out of the British political system. And in my sense, this is the project that's going on now. And I think this is what Starmer is about, actually. I think he's about killing off that socialist project, that socialist being in society, or whatever shape it's got, and replacing it with a centre party, which is a refusion of Liberals and the Labour Party. And I exclude, my ignorance of Scotland is huge, Matthew, so I exclude Scotland from this because I know it's different. And so I think that my issue is what do Marxists do when there's a clear offensive by the ruling class on the working class politically through the Labour Party, and it's an offensive that might win? How do we organise in case of their victory, which I think is pretty certain, actually? But how do we organise as Marxists, and how do we campaign for Marxist politics? I'm not against people fighting. If they're Labour Party members, I'm not saying don't do that, you're wasting your time. That wouldn't be my argument. I know some people think that. I think, say, fight as hard as you can. But I really don't think that it's going to be a victorious struggle. And my concern is that the more people are there fighting in what is in a declining situation over years, maybe a decade, will demoralise another layer of people. What should we be doing? I must be confused about the debate as well. I'm sure a lot of people are, about what do we do next and how do we organise ourselves. I think we clearly need to work on a process of regrouping the left around socialist politics. As part of that regroupment, then people will raise the idea of whether there should be a new mass working class party. I would be amazed if it wasn't the case. And that's a discussion that I think we should encourage. And I think that's a discussion that will put pressure on the Labour Party, no question, and on the left of the Labour Party. At the same time, we have to organise as Marxists and socialists and develop a programme that we think is suitable for like the 21st century. And alongside that, of course, we have to intervene into the class struggle, wherever the class struggle is taking place. I mean, before I came up to this meeting, I was watching the ITV News, and there was a story about carers in Scotland, yeah? And it's not, I think it's because they have a regional, inverted commas, responsibility, they did it from there, but they were pointing out that the Scottish government pays carers, full-time carers, get paid £390 a month and are expected to live on it. We see issues about people in housing who are living in awful conditions in housing, just terrible, terrible conditions. We see a whole series of the working class being pushed down into low-waged pay and into poor occupations, no trade union organisation. Now, the class struggle can impact on this, but I find it difficult to imagine over a period that the people who are on the roughest end of capital and capitalism are going to turn to Starmer and see him as a leader for resolving their issues. And so I think that's why we need to have a discussion about how do we organise the left around socialist politics, people inside the Labour Party, people outside the Labour Party, and have that discussion about working class representation. I just think it's pretty crucial. Otherwise, we'll get 10 years down the line and we'll have been eviscerated. That's my view.
Okay, Will, thank you very much indeed for the excellent introduction and reply. And thanks to everybody for participating in what I thought was quite a lively discussion. Clearly differences of opinions, which is great. We want to encourage people to share and air their differences. Our next meeting is in a fortnight's time. It's on the 29th. We're still sorting out the title and the topic for that, but you'll get one of our bulletins. We are also looking for people who might want to write pieces for our website, so that's something that you might want to consider. We'd also quite like to get feedback on tonight's meeting and on any of the other meetings that you've been on. So if you could spare 5 minutes to give feedback on what you thought was good, what if there was anything, what was bad, what could be improved. If you've got suggestions for other topics that you would like to participate in. And one of the things that's come up in this meeting, and it's come up in other meetings, and Will's just touched on it in his summing up, we do want to get, even if it's an informal network to begin with, of independent Marxists. I class myself, it's a sort of oxymoron in itself, because if you're a Marxist, you believe in the need for organization, revolutionary organization to change things. But I'm not in one of the revolutionary groups. I haven't been for a long time. I imagine that pretty much everybody in this meeting, with maybe one or two exceptions, is also not in an organized group. Lots of us have been through them, and maybe that's why we're not in them now. But we think that there's a space needed and a network needed where people who are Marxists or who are interested in Marxism and communism can get together and to discuss program, strategy, tactics in a comradely forum and an enjoyable event. And so that's another discussion that's ongoing, really. So we'd like people to think about that. How could it function? What would it be like? Give us your thoughts, send them in, and we'll probably be organising a meeting maybe on that question itself at some stage in the future. I'm just going to look finally at the chat. Okay. Yeah, it's just thanks and continuation of the discussion. So with that, I'm going to thank everybody for coming, and hope to see you all again in a fortnight's time. Please tell your friends, your comrades, please advertise it on social media, and turn up next time with some other people. Thank you very much, and good night.